Well, welcome everyone. We're starting our knowledge management at KM KSU Webinars again this semester. I think we have about 17 presentations lined up, so there should be some really interesting events. So one thing I want to also remind everyone who's listening in is that this is also a forum for you to talk about what you're doing. So we hope that you will step up to share what work you're doing. The other thing that we want to try to promote this year is an open discussion of the published research. So if you have a magazine article, a journal article, if you've read a good book lately, and you'd like to have an open session, just an open discussion of that, please let us know. We'll schedule it. We're going to be working with the publishers to make sure that people have access to that. It's a way of taking the literature to the field and making sure that we make that connection really strongly in our field. So my role today is as a facilitator, and I don't want to take too much time talking about the webinars. I'd actually like to go right into introducing our speaker today, who is Brian Moon. I think you've all seen Brian's bio in the announcement, but for those of you who do not yet know Brian, he's a co-founder of Paragean Technologies. He helps organizations improve through smarter use of their own knowledge and also to improve the way knowledge moves through their organizations. He uses applied concept mapping and methods of naturalistic inquiry across a spectrum of knowledge management problems, from the elicitation, assessment, and representation of knowledge to the development of models, content, software, and innovative training that enable its transfer. Brian has conducted R&D activities in the field of naturalistic decision-making and macro-cognition, knowledge modeling, visualization techniques, technology evaluations, workplace design, and expert performance. We call Brian Professor Moon here at Kent State. He has also designed interactive visualization frameworks, workplace configuration for analytic fusion centers, developed metrics to evaluate cognitive impact of information technologies on intelligence analysis, qualitative methodologies, and the design and facilitation of electronic precision units. He has been an active leader in promoting human-centered computing in the intelligence community. He co-chairs the Friends of the Intelligence community. This is a community of practice for cognitive systems engineers supporting the intelligence community. So in addition to all of this groundbreaking work at Paragean Technologies, Professor Moon is also a part-time faculty member at the Information Architecture and Knowledge Management program at Kent State University. At Kent, he currently teaches 2 courses, Knowledge Elicitation and Expertise Management, and Business Narrative and Storytelling. So, Brian, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you. Is that ready?
I am ready.
All right. There we go.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Not yet. You have to share your desktop.
Right. See.
Okay. There should be a little bar up at the top of your screen. There you go.
All right.
All right.
There we
and
go.
I will put everyone on mute, but you tell me when you want me to unmute people.
Okay.
All right.
So you can see my screen, correct?
We can see your screen.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for this opportunity. This is an exciting time, both in the program, from my perspective, as we were talking before the webinar started. Denise noted that there aren't a whole lot of programs, I don't actually know of any, that have as part of their KM curriculum an explicit focus on knowledge elicitation. So I think this is an exciting time to be part of the program. It's also an exciting time to be part of the field, and I'll talk about some of the development in the field of knowledge elicitation. So again, Denise, thanks for inviting me to give this talk. Thanks to everyone for attending, either now or those who are listening at a later date. So what I'd like to do is walk through this agenda, make introductions a little bit more than what Denise just offered, talk about my own proclivities and my own leanings, if you will, in this field. Just review a couple of quick concepts so that people can get grounded in the kinds of terminology that I'll use. Give a very, very brief history of knowledge elicitation in 2 slides or less. I assure you that is a whole other webinar in and of itself. Talk also very briefly about a couple of knowledge elicitation methods that I use and that we teach in the expertise management course. Then I want to move into these advantages and challenges. So what can knowledge elicitation buy us in terms of a knowledge management approach? Talk also about why knowledge elicitation is hard and what are some challenges to implementation. And then lastly, show you a couple of examples of bringing or sometimes even sneaking knowledge elicitation in. How do we get this sort of thing integrated into our organization, both in terms of large programs, but also maybe kind of sneaking in the back door. So with that overview agenda, talk a little bit about myself. There I am from the page of the faculty list at Kent State. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Paradigm Technologies. Folks often ask where our name comes from. I chose technology because in the true sense of that word, technology is really a method for achieving some sort of outcome. And so the methods that we use are the technologies. We also are actually involved in developing some information technologies. The Paradigm piece comes from, if anyone's familiar with the orbit of planets or satellites around larger planets. The perigee is, of course, when that orbit is the closest to the larger planet. In our case, the Moon being closest to the Earth, and those are the periods during which the greatest effects are felt on the Earth. So that's where we came up with the perigee. Our company offers direct services to government and commercial clients. We also train our methods, and we conduct research and development in the methods that we use, and also in applications of those methods. Prior to starting the company, I also worked for Klein Associates Applied Research Associates, and if you recognize the name Klein there, that refers to Gary Klein, who's a pioneer in the field that we'll discuss of knowledge elicitation, and well known for his own studies and books on expertise and what it means to be an intuitive decision maker. Prior to that, I actually worked for a nonprofit criminal justice organization, the National Center on Institutions and Alternatives, where I helped defense teams understand and put into context their clients, particularly in capital murder cases. So I like to talk a bit about that work because what thread does run through all of these corporate positions is a focus on interviewing and observing and eliciting knowledge from people, particularly in circumstances in the defense work, from people who didn't necessarily want to share knowledge. So my primary experience is in doing knowledge elicitation and doing lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of interviews in all sorts of circumstances. So my proclivities, which you might have gleaned from the introduction, very interested in the social sciences, particularly fields of expertise studies and naturalistic decision-making, symbolic interactionism, These three fields are really about going out into the real world and understanding the decisions that people are making, the tasks that they perform in the performance. But it really is focused on the real world. So all of these social science fields are about going out, getting out of the laboratory, if you will, and going out and then really seeing how the world works. Very much influenced by naturalism in the physical sciences, but in a social science setting. My other proclivity is to be very pragmatic and try to bring some of the both methods and findings from the social science disciplines into the real world. So we want to go out and not only understand the real world, but we want to apply what we learn back into that real world. So later on, you'll hear me discuss a couple of projects. And what I want to get across there is that my particular interest in knowledge management is how can we get better at being able to bring these validated methods into a practical approach in knowledge management. So I want to go over just a couple of concepts just to be sure that everyone understands what I mean by these terms. So when I talk about knowledge elicitation, what I'm really referring to is the co-creation of knowledge. That is a knowledge elicitor scaffolding an expert to articulate their expertise. It really is about an interaction. It's about using structured approaches to help that expert relay what it is that the expert thinks about and kind of what goes through their head when they're executing their expertise. So that sort of relationship is very much a two-way street. We know a lot about experts. One of the key things that we know is that sometimes it can be difficult for them to actually articulate what is at the root of their expertise. And so this practice of knowledge elicitation is sort of helping that expert to articulate what they know. When I talk about expertise, I'm really referring to the accumulated experience that enables what we call macrocognition. Macrocognition, and you can see the diagram here. Macrocognition is several things. It's sort of a movement, if you will, within the cognitive sciences to focus more on the way that people actually work in the real world, as opposed to in the laboratory, where a lot of psychology is focused, typically on college students, typically on toy problems, and not very naturalistic, so not really in the real world. What we're looking at in macrocognition is the kinds of functions that people are trying to perform, how they make decisions, how they make sense of the world, how they go about planning and adapting, and how they learn. We're also very interested in the underlying processes that support those functions. So how it is that people detect problems and manage risk and uncertainty, and how they coordinate across teams. So when I talk about expertise, I'm talking about the way that an individual's accumulated experience enables them to do all of these things. Expertise, for me, is generic in the sense that we see the same sorts of expert behaviors and capabilities across all domains, many domains, I should say, because we certainly haven't studied all domains, but the field at this point has looked far and wide at many domains of work, to include certainly a lot of work in healthcare, a lot of work within the military, both in kinetic operations and non-kinetic. So, you know, blowing things up, but also thinking about the way that the enemy thinks. Those are two areas: intelligence analysis, as Denise mentioned earlier, and many industrial domains. I've done personally a lot of work in the nuclear domain. So we see across all of these domains the kinds of macrocognitive functions that I just mentioned, and we see them play out in many of the same ways. So we look at expertise within a domain and use the knowledge elicitation methods to study what expertise looks like in that given domain. But we're always looking more generically at expertise. So just a real brief history of knowledge elicitation. The history starts off with everything before the 1980s, and that's where we would be here all day if we were to try to walk through that history. We do go over the history in more detail in our expertise management course at Kent State, but where knowledge elicitation as a field really starts to take shape is in the early 1980s, as computer scientists were beginning to think about how computers might be built such that they could become expert systems and they could provide some support to people in their workplace. It was maybe not quickly realized, but it was certainly realized that in order to build such systems, the hardest part of those systems was going to be acquiring the knowledge on which those systems could be based. So this knowledge acquisition bottleneck became realized by computer scientists who were trying to build the expert systems. They went searching for techniques and approaches and people that could help them with this knowledge acquisition bottleneck. That gave rise to, in the 90s, a more systematic comparison of various ways to do knowledge elicitation. And that's really when social scientists started to get involved, and you start to see sort of a coming together, if you will, of the computer and the social sciences in the 90s. There were many approaches that were developed and codified and experimented with and validated throughout the 1990s. So that by the time we get to the 2000s, many of the methods were sort of in place, and the efforts turned more to how can these methods be applied in a variety of settings. And at that point, practitioners of all types started essentially making businesses out of doing knowledge elicitation. So that's a real quick overview. There are certainly places that interested parties can go look to better understand where knowledge elicitation came from. If you want to get very deep, you can go all the way back to the 17 and 1800s, where you started to focus on industrial processes, and you had a number of folks, particularly in Europe, who started to take a more concerted look at that process and in decision making. So there's actually a number of really interesting papers and chapters and books that show the very early days of knowledge elicitation. So across those couple of decades, what we've come to as a field is a really deep understanding of expertise. On the left side here, Gary Klein's book, Sources of Power, is the seminal publication for articulating what it is that experts are able to do, how people make decisions in time-pressured, constrained environments, how they're able to show up on a scene and quickly understand what is happening, what has happened, and what is likely to happen. So Sources of Power is a good resource to understand this kind of naturalistic decision-making approach. So that's the content that we've discovered by taking these methods out into the real world. Working Minds and Perspective on Cognitive Task Analysis, these are good references to really understand the methods themselves. So Working Mind is another seminal publication from Beth Crandall of Klein Associates ARA, Gary Klein, and Robert Hoffman from the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. Just a quick word about Robert. He is our leading authority on methodology of knowledge elicitation. So having done a series of comparative studies of the different knowledge elicitation methods, he's sort of your go-to person for methodological discussions with regard to knowledge elicitation. Perspectives on Cognitive Task Analysis goes deep into these historical origins, and it was also written by Robert and Laura Militello, who, much like myself, is a practitioner that came out of of the Gary Klein School of Knowledge Elicitation. Applied Concept Mapping is my book. It focuses on a particular method that we'll talk about in a moment, which is Applied Concept Mapping. And it sort of sits between, on the left of it, the methodological books, and on the right, the case studies, the lessons learned, the applied benefits that we know can come out of the application of knowledge elicitation. So there's the Modern Technology Failures in Cognitive Engineering Successes book. It's a really nice encapsulation of a series of case studies where knowledge elicitation has been put to use, and we've been able to actually gather data with regard to how successful the application of knowledge elicitation was to whatever problem it was addressed toward. Accelerate Expertise, this is a brand new book that just came out from Robert Hoffman and colleagues, and it is about how we can use knowledge elicitation on the front end of designing training for high proficiency in a complex world. So, so not only has knowledge elicitation been applied for technology engineering, but also the engineering of training that really enables us to accelerate the way that people move up the expertise ladder. So if you're really interested in the field and want to kind of dive in, these would be a good place to start. And for those who are interested in reading this, feel free to follow up with me afterward. I can certainly point you to other publications. So just a couple of does anyone have any questions about the history piece we just went through? Denise, you may want to unmute.
Let me just unmute everyone. Sorry.
Any questions about the history piece? Okay, I'm not hearing any direct questions, so we'll move forward. So I'll talk. The next piece will be about methods of knowledge elicitation. Denise, you might want to mute again.
I'm working through it.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
So there are many methods that both legitimately fall under knowledge elicitation and some even that folks would like to consider knowledge elicitation, and the hardcore methodologists might take umbrage with. But the point here is that there are many ways to do knowledge elicitation. Some of them have been studied and validated more than others. Some of them, in particular the two that I'll talk about, are considered sort of the gold standard, if you will, for doing knowledge elicitation. They come with their own advantages and disadvantages. But the two that I'll talk about, the first is the critical decision method. So this is an incident-based technique coming out of Flanagan's critical incident technique from the 1950s. This is an interviewing approach that's structured around real lived experiences. So we actually talk to people about events that they've been involved in where their expertise came into play and had some sort of effect on the outcome. The goal of the critical decision method is to uncover the critical cognitive elements in the performance of that expert and, almost more importantly, the surrounding context. So we try to understand expertise in context of the way that it played out. The critical decision method, one of the reasons it is the gold standard is because it's adaptable to a variety of purposes, and those include capturing very detailed case studies, but also capturing scenarios that can be used for training and capturing really the richness, if you will, of the knowledge elicitation data sets that are able to be captured. You really see a lot of expertise when you use the critical decision method. There are essentially 4 steps to the critical decision method. We try to identify the incidents that make the most sense in the context of the work we're doing and help the expert select which one might be most useful. We then walk a first sweep through the timeline so that we understand what all went into the incident. And along the way, we're also identifying the key decision points. So where did that expert implement the macrocognitive elements of performance? We're identifying those along the way. We then take one deeper, very deep sweep back through the story so that we are getting all of the perceptual and attention and management and uncertainty management. We're really getting the story from the perspective of the expert. And we have been known to go into excruciating detail with experts to really get them to think through what were the kinds of cues and factors that supported the decision they made. So this can be, frankly, quite mentally exhausting for some experts to have to go through this kind of focus on their own expertise. When we have time and when it's the focus of the project, we'd like to take one more sweep through, which is to say, what if things were different? And this helps to reveal expert-novice differences, decision errors that were made, and even the technology and organizational barriers and workarounds that the expert used. So the critical decision method is there's a lot of literature about it that's available. You can see both the descriptions of the method and methodology projects that compared it to other methods. And we use it a lot in the work that we do because it is so useful and because it's kind of the gold standard. Applied concept mapping is a second method that we use quite a bit. Approach is based on Joe Novak's education methods in the early 1970s, where he and his colleagues at Cornell were looking for ways to enable teachers to rapidly understand where their students were on the learning curve. So they developed concept mapping as a diagrammatic approach to quickly enable a student to offer their understanding of a given topic. Since Joe Novak used it in education and later in the 1990s started using it for corporate purposes, and in fact spent several years at Procter & Gamble implementing concept mapping as an approach for them to use for brainstorming, for knowledge management, and for a lot of other purposes. Joe and others, Robert and myself included, have developed protocols to do knowledge elicitation approaches to concept mapping, and that's what we call applied concept mapping. There's a variety of software supports for doing concept mapping. I am partial to the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition's CMAP tools, which was developed to flexibly support the creation and editing and sharing of concept maps. It is free, so folks who are interested in exploring it can go out and use it today. But a major advantage of applied concept mapping is, as an elicitation method, is that it gives you an immediate diagrammatic output. You walk out of a knowledge elicitation session using applied concept mapping with a product, which is different than a lot of knowledge elicitation methods, which require additional analysis of the content that might be captured in a knowledge elicitation session. Whereas a concept mapping session, you come out of that session with a product. So if you're not familiar with concept maps, this is what a concept map looks like. It's a pretty basic concept map just describing concept mapping, applied concept mapping. But you see a couple of things right off the bat. You see a semi-hierarchical shape of the diagram, but it's not a strict hierarchy as you see a link going from concept mapping over to educational settings, or the method itself is very flexible with regard to what sorts of hierarchies and shapes you might want to diagram in. The key elements, though, that differentiate concept mapping from other mapping approaches, like mind mapping, for instance, is the explicit representation of the relationships between the concepts. So between each concept, you'll see a linking phrase that specifies what the relationship is between those concepts. So from this very simple approach of stating concepts and stating their relations, the applied concept mapping approach can be effectively used to capture mental models that experts might have, can capture reasoning processes and other types of processes. And there are lots of other advantages to doing concept mapping, particularly in a computer-based way where you can attach other resources to these concepts. And so if this kind of knowledge elicitation method is of interest to folks, you know, the book Applied Concept Mapping is certainly a good place to start, but and also picking up CMAP tools and starting to use it yourself. But I encourage folks to look into concept mapping as a way to get their feet wet in knowledge elicitation. Any questions about the method?
Let me unmute everyone.
Okay.
I think you're good to go.
So let's move on to talk about some of the advantages of knowledge elicitation. Why do folks want to use it, and what can it buy us? So the applications of knowledge elicitation for me and for many others are in these three areas of expertise management. A key application there is in preserving knowledge in order to mitigate the knowledge loss risk. So there's been quite a bit of material published with regard to industries being quite concerned about the baby boom and losing that expertise that has been built up over the past 30 and 40 years. So knowledge elicitation is a primary tool, if you will, to help mitigate that problem. Also in accelerated learning, so bringing novices more quickly along the learning curve. Knowledge elicitation is useful both as a process to help them accelerate their own learning if the elicitor is the one who's the target of it, accelerated learning, but also to accelerate learning across the entire novice spectrum. And in the area of human-centered engineering, knowledge elicitation is kind of a bread and butter play for really understanding the users that you're trying to support for whatever your engineering project might be, whether it's software design, workspace design, or organizational design. Knowledge elicitation is looked at as the right way to start all of those kinds of processes. So these are the reasons that folks use knowledge elicitation, at least the primary ones. There are some others, including generating innovation and other kinds of knowledge sharing. But when I think about knowledge elicitation, I really think about it in these three areas. There are there are ways that the knowledge elicitation can be used to apply into these three areas, and that's kind of what differentiates them. At the end of the day, for me, the knowledge elicitation methods are sort of the same across all these application areas. It's just the way the knowledge is used beyond the elicitation itself differentiates these areas. So I want to talk real quickly about a particular case study in a landmine project. I raised this case study. It's an example of the accelerated learning, and it comes to us from the book I mentioned earlier, the Cognitive Engineering Success Stories. And it's one of these rare cases where we were able to, when I say we, it's not actually my project, I mean we, the larger community, but where we were actually able to implement knowledge elicitation, get buy-in early on, see how we can make best use of it in the context of a project, and then in an even more rare instance, actually able to measure the effects of using knowledge elicitation. So it's a really nice story that walks us all the way through what the advantages can be. So in the late 1990s, the landmine detection technology and training that was available wasn't working very well. There were published studies of less than 15% probability of detection using a combination of people and tools. That gave rise to some major technology development programs. one in particular was cited as going for 9 years and $38 million, and still not doing very well in terms of outcomes. So even after the application of new technologies, the field was still only up to about 55 to 58% probability of detection, and for the most difficult cases, the low metal mines, the probability of detection was still down where it was prior to the introduction of these new technologies. So this was an opportunity to put knowledge elicitation into play to try to understand if the fitness, if you will, between the cognition of the operator and the technology advantages could be brought closer together. So could we look at the way that people use the technology and thought through the technology and applied their own expertise? Could we get a more tight fit between that and the technology development? So Jim Wazowski at Carnegie Mellon was invited to be a part of the development team, and what he did was he looked across the a number of classes that were teaching landmine detection, and while the probabilities that I just gave you were averages, he looked at the folks that were actually on the higher end of those averages. So folks who we could call experts by virtue of not only their resume, but their actual performance in the task. He found a couple of those people and then applied knowledge elicitation methods to them. So really got them to think through how they were thinking through doing landmine detection. So used a couple of protocols to include a think aloud protocol where he would, again, help scaffold that person in thinking about what they were thinking about. So the thinking aloud protocol has someone actually talk through what they're thinking as they go through a task. So it's one of those other knowledge elicitation methods that actually is quite useful in this kind of context, because you can get real world, real involved task type of expertise relayed in a think aloud protocol. From what he learned from those experts, he developed a training program called Cognitive Engineering based on expert skill, and then introduced it back into the same training program. And because he had sponsors of the project who were very interested to see if he could make a difference, was able to actually introduce the training program into an experimental setting where he could have controls and understand differences between people who got the training based on experts and those who didn't. And while you're waiting with bated breath, I'm sure, to hear the results, they were pretty astounding. So the probability of detection after the first training group went all the way up on average to over 94%. For the low metal mines, it was at 87%. So the difference between thinking about how to implement this technology without focusing on how experts did it, and then thinking about implementing the technology with a close cognitive fitness to what those experts did, it's pretty astounding what the differences were. These findings, incidentally, were replicated over a number of studies with a bunch of different control conditions. So it's a really clear example of what knowledge elicitation can buy when you really spend time and use these kinds of methods to focus on expertise. These are the kinds of advantages that are possible. Any questions about the advantages?
Brian.
Yep.
The accelerated expertise method is very interesting, and the steps are very logical. Do you guys follow certain procedure in every case, or every case has different way of dealing with it?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. So the methods are the procedures. When I talked earlier about the critical decision method, let me just get back to that. The critical decision method is a structured interview, and so this allows the elicitor to structure the interview such that they can enable that expert to articulate their experience, because it's a storytelling method. Essentially, you're trying to draw out the story behind the story. So these are the steps, if you will. But it's also flexible. Some people call it semi-structured because it allows for the elicitor to dive deep where they think it's appropriate to dive deep, and it's not structured in the sense of we don't have a set of questions that we know going in. Rather, what we have is the structure of the conversation that we're going to have. And so that's what these kinds of methods can allow for. It allows you some flexibility, but also gives you advantages in the interview setting because you sort of know where the story is going to go, and that gives you an ability to run the interview. With the applied concept mapping, there is a method behind getting to this kind of diagram. Real quickly, the method in way too abbreviated steps, but the method is basically we try to get a focus question for each concept map. So whatever the focus of the expertise is at that point will become a starting focus question. We then try to elicit as many of these concepts, that is the things within the circle. We try to elicit those as a way to get the expert just to give a first glance view of what are the key concepts that might have to answer this question. We then spatially organize, and then over time, as more concepts come out, we then start to make these specific connections between the concepts. So we add the linking phrases, and we create what we call propositions, which is a concept, a linking phrase, and the other concept that it's linked to. And those organized set of propositions then creates the entire concept map. So as you can imagine, it's a very iterative process. It involves not only knowing what concept maps are and knowing how to ask the right kinds of questions to help an expert elicit, what that expert knows. It also involves, if you're doing it in a computer-based approach, it also involves managing software and managing the interview session itself. So there's a lot that goes on in a concept mapping session. One of the chapters in the Applied Concept Mapping book is titled Skills in Applied Concept Mapping. So it really walks through all of the different skill sets that come into play when you're doing applied concept mapping. So yes, there are protocols. They're intended to be guides for knowledge elicitors, but depending on not only which domain you might be working in, but what your expert is about, depending on what kind of person that expert is, these things can go in different directions, and I'll actually talk a bit about that next. So let me go now into some of the challenges. As some of you who are new to knowledge elicitation might be starting to understand, one of the key challenges to knowledge elicitation is that it is a skill like many of the experts that we work with. There's skill in which method to use. There's skill in which kind of knowledge area to go after and where to spend your time. There's a bit of skill, frankly, in selecting who might your best knowledge elicitors be in a given organization. So that's another way that selection is important. Then there's the skill of actually applying the methods themselves, the ones that I just walked through. As I suggested, these are meant to be guidance for elicitors, but they are not steps. They are not specific questions that you ask. And so being able to apply that semi-structured methodology and be able to flex your methodology depending on what is happening in the session, those are skills that take some time to develop. There's a skill also in analyzing what it is that you're getting from the expert. So both during a session, how you analyze what that expert's giving you and what that means for which direction you next go in an interview. And also then analyzing the outcomes of the knowledge elicitation session. So taking, particularly if you're working across a number of experts, being able to get in there and dig around in the data and find really what's important. And then to represent it in a way that supports your project goals. It may be that you're after stories, and so the story is the representation itself, or you're after findings where you're looking to create findings across a number of experts and represent them in a way that can give advantage to perhaps other folks on your team, like designers, for instance, or people who are programming software tools. So knowledge elicitation is a skill-based practice, which means that it takes practice. I mentioned my background earlier as a way to introduce this idea that people who are looked at as being proficient and expert knowledge elicitors have likely been doing it for many, many years. I myself started really doing interviewing in 1996, and so and that's across all those contexts I talked about earlier. So it does take it takes a lot of practice, both within kind of real world situations where you get to work with a lot of different kinds of people. There are ways to practice concept mapping and critical decision method in a safer environment, but it does take a lot of practice. It's also a task, which means people have to make room for it. They have to devote resources to it. They have to devote one of the most important resources, which is time. Knowledge elicitation, to do it well, takes time. To walk through a critical decision method interview, the rule of thumb is about 2 hours, and that's just for one incident. So you're looking at one event in that person's life and trying to get that much detail. There are certainly mythical stories out there of knowledge elicitation going on for 16 hours about one particular event. And the applied concept mapping is no different. It takes a fair amount of time to get a decent draft concept map built so that you can turn it into the kind of diagram that I showed earlier, which was much more refined. But that sort of thing takes a lot of time. And also another challenge is that knowledge elicitation in and of itself is not always about transfer. So perhaps it should be more about transfer, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But generally speaking, knowledge elicitation is thought of as an approach to have very expert knowledge elicitors work with very expert folks in whatever field they're working in. So it's not the knowledge elicitor to whom the knowledge transfer actually needs to undergo. The knowledge elicitor is typically the person who's going to transfer that knowledge somewhere else. And so that's a challenge, and of course it affects the way that resources and time are allocated, because you need to then take another step, which is to get into more transfer activities. I want to talk just real briefly also about my experience in working with experts, because this side of knowledge elicitation doesn't get addressed very often. As I showed you earlier, there's lots of books about the methods and how those methods get applied. Very rarely do people actually talk about what it's like to work with experts in this very intimate and social setting. And along the way, I've sort of seen a lot of different personalities, if you will, and those can have a real effect on the way that your knowledge elicitation plays out. So I'll give you a couple of archetypes. I'm certainly not going to name names, but rest assured I have real-world examples for each of these archetypes. So the first archetype is the very skeptical expert. The first question that I can almost place money on that I'm going to hear when I start working with an expert is, how are you possibly going to capture 30 years of my experience? So they're very skeptical at the beginning that this sort of thing is going to get at something that's beneficial to other people. And they're very skeptical both of the methods themselves sometimes, but also just the whole idea of doing knowledge elicitation, and they can be just very skeptical of an entire project, frankly. They can also continue that skepticism into more of a curmudgeon-y kind of, I don't really want to do this, and you young people need to learn the same way I did coming up, and that kind of attitude with regard to knowledge elicitation can, frankly, derail an entire project. I've certainly had it happen where where that skepticism just gets into blatant disregard for the entire effort. And so that can be very hard to work through because, again, those methods give you a way to structure the discussion, but if the person on the other end of the discussion doesn't want to participate, then that can be a major challenge. Sometimes that skepticism focuses explicitly on the methods themselves, and the experts maybe starts to realize that you, as the elicitor, have a bit of experience yourself and are good at what you do, but the expert still wants to sort of challenge you and put challenges both to your methods and even sometimes to your knowledge about the domain that you're working in. That happens quite a bit where you know, because these methods are generalizable across domains, we still have to do a bit of bootstrapping and understand what the domain is that we're working in to be effective with the methods. And so you can get experts who, because they're skeptical about the methods, they can kind of challenge you with domain knowledge. And if you pass the test, then that is certainly helpful. If you don't pass the test, that can go in a couple different directions. But I typically tend to just accept the challenges and maybe take a guess. Sometimes I get the guess right, and that gives me a bit of favor as we move forward. Sometimes I either have no idea or I might know, but I kind of feel like playing the same game, and I'll suggest that I don't know the answer to something. So, you know, you get into these sort of outwitting each other interactions, which you don't want to go too far with, but you know, being able to meet Mr. Miyagi on his own terms, I think certainly can be a useful way to develop rapport, which is really what I'm talking about. You're trying to get to a place with that expert where they're comfortable with you and you're comfortable with them, such that you can start to use the methods as methods and structure the conversation. But rapport building is a huge part of knowledge elicitation. Sometimes the experts will use the opportunity in knowledge elicitation to get up on their soapbox and rail against the machine, or you know, with a lot of the folks that I work with, they're nearing the end of their career and they've got something to say about the organization, and this may be their only opportunity to do it. Whether that's why you're there or not, they may take this opportunity to tell you everything that's wrong with the organization. And again, you know, in order for these knowledge elicitation methods to work, you got to get to a place where you can execute the method. And so sometimes it's in everybody's best interest to let them up on that soapbox, if only for a little while. Offer a sympathetic ear, and as quickly as you can get back into the elicitation methods. Sometimes the information comes fast and furious, and particularly in new domains, and it feels like this young lady does, I'm sure, where it's inescapable and it just keeps coming at you. You're drinking from the fire hose, and the expert assumes a lot about what you know, and so gives you a lot of content really quickly to work with. You know, especially, as I said, in new domains, that can be a real challenge. We always want to do some bootstrapping before we go in to talk to somebody to understand where they are in the organization, what kind of experiences they've had, and also to understand a bit about what their job is about, what kind of roles they play in the organization, so that we can have a bit of context. But even that doesn't always mitigate this problem of a lot of information coming very quickly, and this is why the practice piece of knowledge elicitation matters so much, because you want to have enough comfort with the methods to be able to absorb all this fire hosing in a way that helps you to structure and move forward. Sometimes experts will give you all sorts of platitudes and never quite realize or get on board with you about what their expertise is all about. So they give a lot of you know, kind of hang in there advice, and people these days just have to hang in there and keep trying, and you have to, you know, do the right thing all the time, and a lot of platitudes and leadership speak and inspirational posters. you got to cut through all that, though, because you have to get to the expertise, the macro cognition that we were talking about earlier. You have to get inside their head and understand what they were thinking about as they went through these critical incidents. And so, again, some of this is context building for the knowledge elicitation session itself. They have to understand why you're there, and you have to help them understand why you're there, and get past what they might be used to, which is sometimes experts do their own training, or they might do a lot of mentoring, but that mentoring and training is very shallow, in the sense that, you know, that they're offering this kind of corporate speak around, you know, doing the right thing, as I said, or just kind of hanging in there. And so you got to break through those platitudes if you're going to get the expertise and get inside their head to understand them. While the critical decision method is a storytelling technique, a lot of experts really, really like to tell stories, many of which don't have anything to do with what you're trying to elicit from them. And that can be personal stories or stories about days of old. It could even be somewhat related to the expertise that you're interested in, because it might have given rise to the expertise that you're really interested in. But really, the story that they want to tell you, it's outdated. The organization's not going in that direction anymore. So you have to strike this balance between allowing those storytellers to tell their story, but also letting them allow you to dig deep where you think it's appropriate. And this is about really sort of maintaining control of the interview, so that the story that is elicited is one that meets your project goals. Sometimes we allow the experts to review the products that we create. Certainly that's the case with the concept maps, because we do it live and in front of them and project the concept maps. Sometimes with the critical decision method and other methods that are more narrative and text-based, experts want to review what's been written, which is fantastic. You absolutely want to support that sort of thing, except that sometimes they turn that opportunity into a way to get very Shakespearean about what's been written. Sometimes that can certainly delay a project because you're waiting for feedback from the expert, and experts are extremely busy people, and it may be weeks or months before you actually get their feedback provided to you, which can be a challenge if you're trying to turn their expertise products into products to enable knowledge transfer. So you definitely want to allow them final say on what gets produced, but handle that with care. And lastly, I've actually had some elicitation sessions get derailed because focusing so intensely on somebody's expertise means that the expert's doing the same thing for themselves. And as they talk through incidents, and as they talk through their reasoning strategies, and as they talk through their mental models, they can have discoveries. I've certainly seen eureka moments happen where you're trying to preserve somebody's knowledge, and they sort of realize on the spot that what they've just thought about or what they've just said needs to be included in some current project, or it could be the basis for a new product. And so they forget why you're there, and they want to go sort of follow this eureka moment that they've had. So you definitely want that sort of thing to happen, and you can get a lot of kudos for inciting it to happen in a knowledge elicitation session, but sometimes, frankly, that sort of thing can derail what you were trying to do to begin with. So those are just some of the challenges of actually working with experts, real-world experience that I've had, and some of the different personalities and situations that I've run into. Each of them, while they are challenges, they can also provide you with a foothold. These eureka moments, for instance, can provide you a foothold further into the organization to have everyone realize what the true value is of someone sitting down and doing this very concentrated reflection on their own expertise. If they can promote that eureka moment as one of the advantages that came out of doing that, that's probably a good thing. Let me, because we're at the hour mark here, we'll save all the rest of the questions until the end. Let me walk through some issues with implementation. So how do we get knowledge elicitation into organizations? And I want to talk specifically about one of my implementation projects with the Westinghouse Electric Company. We conducted a series of knowledge elicitation projects across Westinghouse in 2010 and 2012. At the time, much like many other industries, and in particular the utilities and even more particularly within the nuclear industry, there's a lot of concern about this lost knowledge problem. Many of the folks that were around during the first construction of the first fleet of nuclear plants are very near, if not already at retirement age. And because of the particular circumstances of that industry, there hasn't been a whole lot of hiring and training of new folks over the past several decades. So now that the industry is experiencing a bit of a renaissance, what you see is a lot of hiring, but not a whole lot of experience. And so Westinghouse, like others organizations, we're very concerned about trying to capture and preserve some of the expertise of those veterans and bringing it into the training programs that they were beginning to develop with their new employees. They were developing a knowledge management network, which was an intranet for them. It was a custom intranet that they envisioned sort of being housing the expertise that was captured through knowledge elicitation. And so the first part of our project was focused on building content for that knowledge management network. And toward the end of our engagement, we ended up transitioning our work to the Westinghouse University, which meant that we trained a group of future knowledge elicitors in these methods so that they had their own organic capability to move forward the knowledge elicitation program as they saw fit. There are a couple of papers that talk about the work, both the early work and the later work. I want to cover just a couple of highlights from the most recent paper, which was given at last year's annual meeting of the American Nuclear Society. So once the program transitioned into the Westinghouse University and they took charge of the program, they found themselves somewhat restructuring the way that they deliver knowledge elicitation internally. And they essentially offered 4 different services, which are listed on the left. So there was a technical content of interest to many service, which basically meant it was the same sort of elicitation we were doing with experts, spending upwards of 30, 40 hours with those experts. So a very intensive process with the idea that we were going to preserve a great deal of their expertise that would be of interest to many people throughout the organization. There was another approach which was more of a job replacement, so where you had an individual coming in to take over a job, very similar to what other folks do in terms of continuity books and knowledge books. That was the focus of that approach. There was a facilitation service that they offered, so if an expert was giving his or her own training or other kind of mentoring service, the knowledge elicitors would get involved so that they could help, again, help that expert articulate some of the unverbalized content, sort of tacit knowledge that might not come through if an expert trainer just develops their own training. And then finally, there was this critical skill transfer, which was the idea that not only would someone maybe replace someone on a job, but rather this was more of the expert to novice, expert to protege transfer, where you're trying to look at specific skills within that protege and transfer some of the expert skills more directly. And so the protege got very involved in this kind of elicitation. And that was something we introduced actually toward the end of the elicitation that we were doing. We started to get proteges much more involved in the elicitation process so that they could ask questions, they could hear it firsthand coming from the expert, and the products that we developed were ultimately the responsibility of the protege. So going through that process of actually developing content helped not only the capture but also the transfer. The paper actually does a nice job kind of walking through some of the challenges and requirements for these different approaches that they developed. You see some of them, in particular, the technical content of interest to many, very high resource requirements in terms of time and editing and authoring publications. Whereas the job replacement was a bit lower because they were really aimed at, what are the high-level tasks and decisions that might occur in this kind of job. They were developing, as you see on the right, content maps to capture, again, that real kind of high-level information, not getting into the experience of that expert, but rather looking at the job from a higher, more abstract level. The facilitation approach, they use the critical decision method because that helped that expert give context to what they were teaching in the classroom. So actually walking them through an incident that highlights the kind of content that they were teaching. And so this gives you an idea, again, of some of the differences between these kinds of implementations. Westinghouse has done a very nice job making an internal service for themselves and delivering knowledge elicitation as a service, such that their customers, their internal customers, can call on this core of knowledge elicitors to add value wherever one sees it is appropriate. They've mostly focused on that critical skill, and by focus I mean, again, these are the requests coming from their internal customers, so the line managers and the engineering managers. These are the kinds of knowledge elicitation sessions that they were asking for. So a lot about those critical skills, trying to transfer some of those critical skills to proteges. They have done some of the more kind of intensive technical content elicitation that I was doing. And just to give you a sense of what that looked like, over a series of several months, and in some cases almost a whole year, we would spend upwards of 40 hours with those experts, going into great detail that included topics such as specifics around particular nuclear plants, but also around some of the engineering breakthroughs that had happened at Westinghouse. And spending 40 hours with an expert over 6 to 9 or 12 months, that is a very, very intensive knowledge elicitation program. It's expensive for everyone involved because you're not only paying for the elicitation side, you're paying for that expert's time as well. Experts are very busy people, and getting them to give up that time is a real challenge. So I look at Westinghouse as, again, sort of a gold standard for how you would do implementation well in an organization, because they committed the resources to it and they realized the gain from it. So if that's a gold standard for implementation, how might we think about sort of sneaking some of this knowledge elicitation into an organization where we don't have the kinds of resources and commitment from the organization, but we still want to realize some of the benefits? There are a number of places where I think knowledge elicitation can be effectively deployed. One area is actually onboarding, and by this I mean not only can the content from knowledge elicitation be used as onboarding material, but I would actually like to see organizations use knowledge elicitation as one of the skills that they implement during onboarding. So if the kinds of skills that I've talked about could be introduced early in someone's career, they're the folks who are going to benefit the most, first of all, from the knowledge transfer. But they're also the people who are going to have the most opportunity to implement knowledge elicitation, whether it's around the water cooler or perhaps on travel opportunities as you're between tasks. If proteges and novices, if they have some insight into what knowledge elicitation is, if they have the kinds of tools that I've been talking about, they can take advantage of all those opportunities to do knowledge elicitation in a much more opportunistic kind of way. Knowledge elicitation certainly can come into play on the front end of those training development and engineering projects. The validity of doing that in a variety of approaches, human-centered computing and human systems engineering and decision-centered design. Those methodologies are fairly well established. They've been vetted across a number of domains. So knowledge elicitation as a way to, at the very start of these kinds of projects, a way to understand how experts do it, and then modeling your training and your engineering projects on the execution of that expertise. It's certainly a way of sneaking it in, but frankly, it should just be done. Also, in project plans, you know, as projects evolve, there are various opportunities, both at the beginning and in the middle, and certainly toward the end, to capture what was learned, to capture the cognition, the decision making that happened along the way, to make sense of where a team is at a given time, and to even think about what the initial plan was and how it's changed and where it might be adapted for future execution. Knowledge elicitation in project plans is a very useful tool. And then lastly, in succession planning, as organizations start to realize that some of their critical performers are going to be moving on, if you can focus your succession planning on those macrocognitive skills, those are going to be the ones that you're going to want to hire for. Those are going to be the ones that you want to develop training programs around. Not just that job role, but really those macrocognitive skills is where you should focus your succession planning, and knowledge elicitation is a way to help you do that. So that's it for the formal presentation. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that folks have. I did want to mention that I'll talk to Denise about some future topics. My approach at this point is to get some feedback from folks who hear this presentation, and if there are areas that folks are very interested in hearing more about. So that could be just expertise generally. We can certainly dive deep into expertise. We can dive much deeper into the implementation piece and how you get these programs into organization. We can certainly go into more detail about the methods. And we can talk about what I was just hinting at there at the end, which is what are the implications for design interventions once you've gathered knowledge elicitation derived data? What can you do with it to enhance and accelerate the way that people learn and perform their work? So those are all topics that I'd be happy to offer another webinar on. And at this time, I'll open up for questions.
Well, I've unmuted everyone, but Brian, thank you so much. This, you know, it was a wealth of information here. I think we were all just trying to take it in.
Yeah.
We probably won't have questions for a few days yet because it's still all sinking in. But the one thing I must say is that it was all understandable. So I really appreciate the way that you presented it for us today. So thank you so much.
Sure.
And let me open it up to questions or comments, as you said, any of these topics for discussion. Do any of you see this as a valuable competency to have within your organization?
I think it's a very valuable competency, and I echo Dr. Denise. She said it's very, very interesting and very useful presentation. I just have a question about the future of knowledge elicitation. I just was, during the presentation, I was imagining that do you think that this will, like a machine, elicit human tacit knowledge? Is that something that in the future, using all the ontologies and all the semantic technology?
Yeah, that's a good question, and certainly one that the field has wrestled with, really going all the way back to the start of expert systems. You know, on the one hand, you can realize that this has been a question that's been around for several decades, and wonder if it's just the fact that the technology wasn't quite there yet. Or you can also think that perhaps there is something to this idea of the flexibility that you can only get when you have human-to-human interaction. you know, I mentioned some of the skepticism and some of the interpersonal stuff that can happen during these elicitation sessions. I know that that sort of thing only gets magnified when a computer is introduced haphazardly, if you will, into the process. Now, having said that, you know, we use content mapping, applied content mapping. We use CMAP tools. I see Paulo on the line here, and this is a good time to announce the International Conference on Content Mapping is happening later in the year in September. And for folks who are interested, certainly I'll be making announcements about that conference. But being able to capture expertise in the form of concept maps does make it shareable, does make it searchable, does make it findable. And so there are really major advantages to why we do the concept mapping, because it does introduce capabilities beyond what are possible when it's just human-to-human discussion. And so we're conscious and we are pushing the envelope, I think, in many ways to think, how can we get more computer-based knowledge elicitation? But again, I say computer-based in the sense that the tools can certainly support the process. They can certainly enable the products, and they can do amazing things once the products are developed. But I think for the foreseeable future, knowledge elicitation will be a human-to-human activity. You know, there are lots of folks within the knowledge management community who are particularly outspoken about the value of dialogue and of conversation. I certainly have sympathies toward those voices. But having said that, you know, knowledge elicitation is a particular type of conversation that has very specific aims and provides very specific structure and tools to enable the right kinds of conversations to happen. So I am very much sympathetic to conversations, and yet I want to see specific kinds of conversations happen. I think of a more fruitful future vision to start working toward is the idea of diffusing the expertise in knowledge elicitation. That is, we need to get more people doing knowledge elicitation. We need to get these kinds of skills out there in the world so that people can more seriously consider what expertise is, and they can manage it better. And that's certainly one of the values of the course that we're teaching here at Kent State.
Brian, this is Denise. Do you see an opportunity for students who take your course to work with organizations to test out some of these ideas?
Do I see? Right. So we've taught the class now twice, and there have been a number of well, one of the exercises in the class is actually to do that. So to take it out into the organization and try it out, whether that's doing content mapping or the critical decision method. That is one of the assignments. And so what we do is, and this is, Denise, as you know, one of the challenges with offering this course online is that we can't provide the level of coaching that we otherwise would, and that we do provide as part of our training offering. But just being able to go through the exercise to realize, you know, how challenging it is, and to realize some of those core issues that I talked about earlier, to realize the resources that are required to do it well. That's really what we're after in the course, is to get that experience. And now I can say that some of the students have used that opportunity to work with real experts in their organization who the organization is concerned about losing. So they've really taken up the opportunity as a way to not only start to enhance their own skills, but create products that should be useful to the organization. And since we've done it twice, I've heard a couple of rumblings about students after the class also continuing to use these kinds of methods. So, but typically they're in the same kind of challenging position that many folks are who are trying to introduce knowledge management of any variety, and that is to try to get the buy-in, get the interest, and get the opportunity to be able to try these sorts of things out, which makes the practice piece even harder because, you know, I've been very fortunate to, early on in my career, to be sort of thrown into the pool and invited to swim. So doing interviews with a variety of people, but actually getting the opportunity to do a lot of interviewing is not something that a lot of people get.
So what I'm hearing is that we need to create more pools for everybody so that there are more invitations to swim.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Brian, let me give you an opportunity. I've mentioned that you teach for Kent State, but I think you also do some targeted workshops for business, correct?
Right. We so in many ways the Kent State Expertise Management and Knowledge Elicitation course is a drawn-out version of a workshop that we provide to organizations who are trying to develop this kind of capability organically, where we spend a couple of days going in much greater detail than I did in this talk, but through the methods, that's when we start the coaching and the practicing, and we're able to tailor those workshops for each individual's organization's needs. We can do anywhere from 1 to 5 days. As you can imagine, 5 days of intensive knowledge elicitation practice is a pretty exhausting thing, but it does allow us to help the organization in some cases select who would be really good at this and who might not be. And I say that because you know, with the rapport building and with the multitasking and a lot of the other skills that are necessary for good knowledge elicitation, not everybody has those skills, and so it's a good way for organizations to also think about who would really be good at developing into knowledge elicitation.
Yeah. I really like your idea of doing this as part of the onboarding process. I think that's just a brilliant idea. And I think people who are involved in talent management or strategic workforce planning, this should be a key tool that they're working with.
I agree.
Brian, thank you so much again. This is wonderful. So,
thank you.
And we will wait to hear what topic you want to talk about next week. And everybody, please come back next week and bring your friends. Now, the URL for this webinar will also be posted to the KM KSU Wiki shortly. So please feel free to share it with all of your friends and colleagues. This is open, and we want to keep the dialogue moving.
Great. Thanks, Denise.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Well, welcome, everyone. We're starting our Knowledge Management at KM KSU Webinars again this semester. I think we have about 17 presentations lined up, so there should be some really interesting events. So one thing I want to also remind everyone who's listening in is that this is also a forum for you to talk about what you're doing. So we hope that you will step up to share what work you're doing. The other thing that we want to try to promote this year is an open discussion of the published research. So if you have a magazine article, a journal article, if you've read a good book lately, and you'd like to have an open session, just an open discussion of that, please let us know. We'll schedule it. We're going to be working with the publishers to make sure that people have access to that. It's a way of taking the literature to the field and making sure that we make that connection really strongly. in our field. So my role today is as a facilitator, and I don't want to take too much time talking about the webinars. I'd actually like to go right into introducing our speaker today, who is Brian Moon. I think you've all seen Brian's bio in the announcement, but for those of you who do not yet know Brian, he's a co-founder of Perigean Technologies. He helps organizations improve through smarter use of their own knowledge and also to improve the way knowledge moves through their organizations. He uses applied concept mapping and methods of naturalistic inquiry across a spectrum of knowledge management problems from the elicitation. And I will put everyone on mute, but you tell me when you want me to unmute people.
Okay.
All right.
So you can see my screen, correct?
We can see your screen.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for this opportunity. This is an exciting time, both in the program, from my perspective, as we were talking before the webinar started. Denise noted that there aren't a whole lot of programs, I don't actually know of any, that have as part of their KM curriculum an explicit focus on knowledge elicitation. So I think this is an exciting time to be part of the program. It's also an exciting time to be part of the field, and I'll talk about some of the development in the field of knowledge elicitation. So again, Denise, thanks for inviting me to give this talk. Thanks to everyone for attending, either now or those who are listening at a later date. So what I'd like to do is walk through this agenda, make introductions a little bit more than what Denise just offered, talk about my own proclivities and my own leanings, if you will, in this field. Just review a couple of quick concepts so that people can get grounded in the kinds of terminology that I'll use. Give a very, very brief history of knowledge elicitation in 2 slides or less. I assure you that is a whole other webinar in and of itself. Talk also very briefly about a couple of knowledge elicitation methods that I use and that we teach in the expertise management course. Then I want to move into these advantages and challenges. So what can knowledge elicitation buy us in terms of a knowledge management approach? Talk also about why knowledge elicitation is hard and what are some challenges to implementation. And then lastly, what it means to be an intuitive decision maker. Prior to that, I actually worked for a nonprofit criminal justice organization, the National Center on Institutions and Alternatives, where I helped defense teams understand and put into context their clients, particularly in capital murder cases. So I like to talk a bit about that work because what thread does run through all of these corporate positions is a focus on interviewing and observing and eliciting knowledge from people, particularly in circumstances in the defense work from people who didn't necessarily want to share knowledge. So my primary experience is in doing knowledge elicitation and doing lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of interviews in all sorts of circumstances. So my proclivities, which you might have gleaned from the introduction, very interested in the social sciences, particularly fields of expertise studies and naturalistic decision-making, symbolic interactionism. These 3 fields are really about going out into the real world and understanding the decisions that people are making, the tasks that they perform in the performance. But it really is focused on the real world. So all of these social science fields are about going out, getting out of the laboratory, if you will, and going out and then really seeing how the world works. Very much influenced by naturalism in the physical sciences, but in a social science setting. My other proclivity is to be very pragmatic and try to bring some of the both methods and findings from the social science disciplines into the real world. So we want to go out and not only understand the real world, but we want to apply what we learn back into that real world. So I'll show you a couple of examples of bringing or sometimes even sneaking knowledge elicitation in. How do we get this sort of thing integrated into our organization, both in terms of large programs, but also maybe kind of sneaking in the back door. So with that overview agenda, talk a little bit about myself. There I am from the page of the faculty list at Kent State. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Perigene Technologies. Folks often ask where our name comes from. I chose technology because in the true sense of that word, technology is really a method for achieving some sort of outcome. And so the methods that we use are the technologies. We also are actually involved in developing some information technologies. The Perigene piece comes from, if anyone's familiar with the orbit of planets or satellites around larger planets. The perigee, of course, when that orbit is the closest to the larger planet, in our case, the moon being closest to the Earth, and those are the periods during which the greatest effects are felt on the Earth. So that's where we came up with the perigee. Our company offers direct services to government and commercial clients. We also train our methods, and we conduct research and development in the methods that we use, and also in applications of those methods. Prior to starting the company, I also worked for Klein Associates Applied Research Associates, and if you recognize the name Klein there, that refers to Gary Klein, who's a pioneer in the field that we'll discuss of knowledge elicitation, and well known for his own studies and books on expertise and
assessment and representation of knowledge to the development of models, content, software, and innovative training that enable its transfer. Brian has conducted R&D activities in the field of naturalistic decision-making and macro-cognition, knowledge modeling, visualization techniques, technology evaluations, workplace design, and expert performance. We call Brian Professor Moon here at Kent State. He has also designed interactive visualization frameworks, workplace configuration for analytic fusion centers, developed metrics to evaluate cognitive impact of information technologies on intelligence analysis, qualitative methodologies, and the design and facilitation of electronic precision units. He has been an active leader in promoting human-centered computing in the intelligence community. He co-chairs the Friends of the Intelligence community. This is a community of practice for cognitive systems engineers supporting the intelligence community. So in addition to all of this groundbreaking work at Perigene Technologies, Professor Moon is also a part-time faculty member at the Information Architecture and Knowledge Management program at Kent State University. At Kent, he currently teaches 2 courses, Knowledge Elicitation and Expertise Management, and Business Narrative and Storytelling. So, Brian, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you. Is that ready?
I am ready.
All right. There we go.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Not yet. You have to share your desktop.
Great. See.
Okay. There should be a little bar up at the top of your screen. There you go.
All right.
All right.